unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grant Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan. Later this week, Prime Minister Narendra Modi will arrive in Washington, D.C. to begin a historic state visit that is expected to further cement ties between the United States and India. Over the past 2 decades, this relationship has gone from awkward resentment during the Cold War to full-throated embrace after the year 2000. But a new essay by Ashley J. Tellis in Foreign Affairs titled America's Bad Bet on India warns that there are limits to U.S.-India cooperation and that Washington would be wise to wake up to them. To talk more about his new essay and the forthcoming state visit, I'm joined today by my colleague Ashley J. Tellis. Ashley holds the Tata Chair for Strategic Affairs at the Carnegie Endowment for National Peace, and I'm pleased to welcome him back to the show. Ashley, good to see you again.
Well, likewise, Milan. Thank you for having me.
So I want to start off by talking about your recent foreign affairs piece, which I should add, and I'm sure our listeners know, has gotten quite a wide reception. But I really want to go back in time and kind of start with first principles, right? Your piece starts with the following statement. I think it's a statement that most of our listeners would likely agree with, and I just want to read it out. You write, for the past 2 decades, Washington has made an enormous bet in the Indo-Pacific that treating India as a key partner will help the United States in its geopolitical rivalry with China. I want you to take us back about 23 years to the George W. Bush administration when this bet really was first made. You had a ringside view, of course, at this time, serving in government. Help us ground this statement in the context of that era when that bet was first being made.
Okay, so I have a confession to make when you ask me a question like this, and I have to confess to the diversity of views that actually existed in the Bush administration at that time when we were setting out to rebuild our ties with India. President Bush had a very simple idea. He thought that India was the paragon of what a liberal democracy ought to be. And he wanted to build a new relationship with India because he thought past US policies had not served their purpose. And so from President Bush's point of view, the relationship with India was important in and of itself. But for those who know American politics well, administrations are complex things. And while the president had a very clear view of the desire for a new relationship with India because it was this exemplary liberal democracy, there were many in his administration who felt that while India as a democracy is important to the United States, it was even more important because of its geographic location and because of the role it could play in the context of balancing China. Now, at that time, US-China relations were in a generally good place, and Sino-Indian relations were in a relatively good place. And so, irrespective of why you thought a good relationship with India was necessary, both sides ended up in the same place. The desire to build Indian power as part of shaping a Pacific Asian geopolitical environment. We didn't need anything of India. We just wanted India to be strong and to be a good friend of the United States. And so whether you wanted a good relationship with India as the president did because of its democracy, or whether you wanted a good relationship with India in order to structure the geopolitical environment to balance China, we both ended up with the view that we need a good relationship with India and we should build it without asking for anything in return. And of course, the US made exemplary investments to that end, including the civil nuclear agreement. But it was really driven by a logic of India becoming something rather than India doing something for us.
So let me just pick up on this point, right? Because you have long argued that Washington should pursue a policy, what you've called strategic altruism vis-a-vis New Delhi. That is, as you stated, the United States should invest in stronger ties between the U.S. and India because India's rise is beneficial not just for Indians, but also for U.S. interests, right? Now, in your foreign affairs piece, you note that this policy, around which there was a bipartisan consensus, was sort of put to the side in favor of a more expansive vision during the Trump administration. I'm wondering if you could describe what was that shift that took place in U.S. policy during the Trump years that I think maybe some of us didn't even really notice was happening.
So I think the shift that took place in the Trump years was an unconscious shift. I don't think someone sat down and said, we have a policy of strategic altruism up to now. We need to change it. Even though Trump's rhetoric often suggested that, there would be no free lunches for our allies and for our partners and so on and so forth. But by and large, I think the shift that occurred was very subtle. And it occurred because there was a deterioration in US-China relations, followed quickly by a deterioration in Sino-Indian relations. And so the world that we knew during the Bush years was no longer the world that we faced in the Trump years. Now we were faced with China as a genuine challenge, if not an adversary. And so it is not surprising that the Trump administration began to look for solutions to how the United States could deal with this new challenge. And of course, it did many things, as Milan, everything from a trade war through to the reconstruction of new partnerships, which were designed to deal with China. The most important of which, of course, was the Quad. I mentioned the Quad because in the Trump administration's worldview, the Quad was going to be this singularly important instrument to balance China's assertiveness. And the Trump administration had a very securitized view of the Quad. That is, the Quad was meant to be a mobilization of collective action, which would engage in a variety of activities, all the way from the diplomatic to the military, with the objective of pushing back against China. Now, India joins the Quad after almost a decade of indecision, not because it liked the Quad, but because it was forced to as a result of Chinese aggressiveness on its own border. But India does something very interesting. It joins the Quad, but it resists the securitization of the Quad. And it treats the Quad more as an instrument of diplomatic mobilization and diplomatic socialization, rather than any effort at collective defense. And I remember discussions during the Trump years with senior administration officials who were very uncomfortable with India's position because they thought that India, being a victim of China, just as the US is a victim of Chinese economic and military malpractice, should have an identical aim, which is to push back and contain China as a straightforward geopolitical adversary. It was very reasonable for the Trump administration to have this view. But India, of course, for very good reasons of its own, demurred. And so it joined the Quad, but with a gigantic asterisk, that this would not be a security organization. It would not be an emerging security community. And it has stayed in the Quad under those same terms to this day. And so that is the transition that I think many people missed in the way that the United States began to look at India. And as I said, it was completely understandable given the changes in the environment.
So let's just burrow down on the security relationship for a second, right? Because as you know better than anyone, the U.S.-India security partnership has traveled quite some distance from the era of the Cold War, when both countries viewed one another with a kind of mutual suspicion, right? And in your piece, you acknowledge that, look, on issues from defense consultations to military collaboration, to defense trade, the relationship has grown in leaps and bounds. At the same time, you note that while security cooperation has proceeded apace, the larger defense relationship faces significant challenges. And I'm wondering if you could characterize those challenges, right? What do you see as the final frontier that has yet to be conquered, or the impediments that exist?
So I would say there are two issues where we have not had the success that we would have liked to see. On the Indian end, the frontier that has yet to be crossed is essentially defense industrial cooperation. India doesn't want India doesn't want the defense relationship to be focused just on consultations or on military to military activities or even on defense trade, because that would be replacing a dependency on Russia with a new dependency on the US. What India wants is that the United States should assist it to produce cutting-edge military technologies indigenously, and thereby assist its rise as a great power. Now, the US supports these ambitions in principle, but it's not clear to me how far we will actually go in practice. Because it's a complicated business. The US government may want to support Indian industry, but US technology is controlled by private companies, which have a profit-making motive. And so unless those profit-making motives can be satisfied, the US government cannot order private industry to go out and assist India. So there are issues there with respect to defense industrial cooperation that we are working out, but the final success is not clearly at hand. There's a larger question. And the larger question is, what is defense cooperation all about? Now, for the United States, defense cooperation is fundamentally about military interoperability. And that is because we tend to think of our friends as essentially either allies or allies in the making. And so we want to be able to partner with the military forces that our allies deploy. We want to be able to operate seamlessly with them in a wide variety of contingencies. Now, India comes from a different place and it has different ambitions. It sees itself as a great power invading. It does not want to be a handmaiden to an existing superpower. And so while India wants to benefit from American proficiency, especially operational proficiency, it doesn't want to be developing sort of linkages that commit it to working with the United States militarily. And so the ambition of interoperability is still an elusive one, as far as we are concerned with respect to India. Now, many Indians sort of almost with the wave of a hand tend to say that, we have all these exercises, so we've done all these things in the humanitarian and disaster relief world, therefore we are interoperable. And I think that is completely misunderstanding what interoperability is about. We have challenges regarding interoperability with our own allies because many of them are not as technologically sophisticated as we are. So being able to seamlessly operate requires much greater integration that India is unwilling to pursue at the moment, primarily for political reasons, but also for operational reasons, because they don't see themselves as being part of any US-led military coalition in the foreseeable future, and therefore do not feel obliged to make the investments in interoperability that I think the United States would like to see in principle.
So let's come directly now to this question of military coalitions, right? You note that the Biden administration has not simply sustained the earlier bet on India; it's really doubled down on it, right? And you argue it's done so on the assumption, however implicit, that Delhi will respond favorably when Washington calls during a regional crisis involving China. Right. And I think this is really where the debate around your essay begins. And I guess my question to you would be, how can we be confident that the Biden administration is proceeding with this assumption in mind? And how confident should we be that India would not intervene with its American friends in a hypothetical conflict with China?
So there are two questions, and I'll take each of those in turn. But let me start off by simply saying that almost everything the Biden administration has done with India is actually the right thing. They've made the right investments. They are pursuing the policies that they inherited from various predecessors. And they want to see this relationship really reach its apotheosis in the years to come. And I am a strong supporter of that general trend. But let me start with the question you asked. How can we be confident that these are the administration's premises? Well, for starters, we can't be confident. And that hinges on the fact when you use the term administration, you're really referring to some sort of an economizing abstraction, right? It's the way we talk about states in international politics. They're abstract entities, they are unitary entities, and they seem to have a singular rationality. The leadership of the Biden administration, the topmost civilian leaders whom I know, I think have no illusions about India. But the US government is a much bigger entity than just the civilian leadership. And there are as many motivations, as many expectations that are different about India as there are individuals and there are bureaucracies in the US government. And so one needs to be more careful when one specifies who exactly one is talking about. I want to go back to a point I made earlier, which is to expect that India will help the United States in a crisis is not an unreasonable expectation on the part of any US administration, because this is the world of international politics. And in the world of international politics, diffuse reciprocity is the thinnest norm that one expects to exist between friends. And especially in the case of India, when we have made extraordinary efforts to build up Indian capabilities and to strengthen the partnership, I would be shocked if the administration had no expectations of India. In fact, it would be odd because we treat India in ways that sometimes we don't treat our closest allies. And so either this is the most dramatic expansion of the notion of strategic altruism, or implicitly and unconsciously, we do want to see India partner with us in different contingencies that we may face across the Indo-Pacific. And that's the reason why we've spent so many resources, over the last 2 decades, building up a military partnership, practicing with India, modernizing its capabilities, and so on and so forth. So the basic point is this. No one can say with certainty what, quote unquote, the administration's expectations are. But I would say having such expectations would not at all be unreasonable from my point of view. Coming to your second question of why do we think India would not participate with us? I think the point that needs to be appreciated is that I believe India will side with the United States in any confrontation that we are engaged in with respect to China. But I think it is unlikely that India will involve itself militarily, short of any direct Chinese threats to India itself. In other words, I think the distinction needs to be appreciated between support for the United States and military involvement in a US-led campaign against China. I think India will do the former. I think it will not do the latter. Now, I will be the first to admit that this is a contingent judgment because it depends on so many circumstances at the moment that this decision is made. But I think a priori, it is not an unreasonable expectation to say that India will sit out active military involvement in a US war with China. And I think there are several reasons for that, which, we can talk about. But I think that would be my bottom line, at least going in. If someone asked me, do you expect India to be a partner in arms in the context of a future conflict in the Indo-Pacific?
Ashley, there's lots of threads here to follow up on. Let me just follow up on them one by one. Just on the bit on strategic altruism. I mean, part of what I hear you saying is that there is still wisdom in the United States pursuing a policy of strategic altruism for all the reasons that you mentioned. However, given that this has been going on for 2 decades, it is natural for people in the U.S. government to develop a higher expectation or higher benchmark against which they want to judge U.S.-India relations, namely that this relationship will morph into some kind of military coalition should the circumstances present themselves. Is that accurate?
I think that's a fair statement. And again, there will be different views on what the entailments of that expectation are precisely. That is, what exactly would we want India to do? I think there'll be different views on that. But I think the India we work with today is not the India we worked with in 2001. And definitely our expectations of India today are different from what they were in 2001. And I think that is the bottom line. And if this relationship develops even further, as we hope, then I think these expectations will only increase. And the press of these expectations will be intensified by circumstances, right? Because if we do end up in a crisis, I think the United States will look around for friends and will judge friends in the manner that they respond. I think this is all too natural, and we cannot wish this away. It's simply the nature of, what political competition requires.
Hey, Grant the Masha listeners. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant the Masha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out.
But, what I hear Indian friends and interlocutors say is there have been relatively few circumstances in recent years in which the PLA has gone head-to-head, toe-to-toe with a foreign military, and 2 of those instances have involved India. First in the Doklam crisis, and then more recently in 2020, continuing to today, the standoff in the Himalayas. And so when push has come to shove, have they not put their money where their mouth is? I think that's what you often hear from the Indian side.
I think India did exactly what I expected India to do, which is India resisted aggression against itself. But the question that we have to face up to is a crisis in East Asia may not involve a direct Chinese aggression against India. But it could involve direct Chinese aggression against another American ally. And if we are talking about a war in the Taiwan Straits or a war over Taiwan, that is simply the most difficult contingency that the United States will face, or will have faced since at least 1991. And that is the moment when the US is going to need all the help it can get. Right? That is the reality of the situation. I mean, this is not something that, we are making up. We are staring this problem in the face. And the debate in this country is, when that will happen, not if that will happen. Now, that's a whole different question, which we need not get involved in. But the point is, if we think it is a realistic possibility that we could end up facing the Chinese in a war over Taiwan, which will really tax US resources to the limit, then the question of, what can our friends do to help us manage those circumstances, I think will be an entirely natural question that all friends of Washington will be faced with. And I don't think India will be able to escape that choice. Now, India can make its own choices, and it will make its own choices. But those choices will present themselves at that point. This is the paradox of the relationship as I see it, that, there is much that we can do short of these scenarios. And there is much that we are doing short of these scenarios. But in the most pressing contingency that the United States could face in East Asia, the relationship with India, no matter how strong and how much we invest in, may still not be able to deliver. And to my mind, that is where the whole idea of strategic altruism gets anchored in, which is, given that fact, do you then stop investing in India? And my answer is no, for other reasons. But you have to recognize that in that moment of extremity, India may not be able to deliver, or may choose not to deliver for very good reasons, based on its own interests.
I just want to parse one more thing that you said, which is, according to you and your engagement with senior officials in the Biden administration, they are not under any illusion about what India's constraints are and how they might act in the event of, say, a Taiwan contingency, right? I mean, and they can be quite explicit about that. But it does seem that you're saying that when it comes to official Washington, which is, the giant blob, as it's famously been termed, it is your belief that there may be some policymakers out there, maybe members of Congress, maybe people in various executive branch agencies, maybe in the intelligence community elsewhere, who do harbor a belief that India will come to America's defense in the event of a direct standoff between the U.S. and China.
There are at least expectations that India will do things in support of the United States in those contingencies. And I spend hours in any given week talking to many of these constituents, telling them that that is an unreasonable expectation of India.
So I want to come back to the end of your previous answer, where you said that, there are many things that the U.S. and India can do together on the security side, short of, collective defense and military coalitions. And I want to, raise a piece that I know you've read, which is by the Stanford scholar Arzan Tadapur, who published a piece in Foreign Affairs, which was responding to your own, in which he said, look, the U.S. and India can do three things together that would be very important for U.S. interests. And Indian interests. The U.S. can bolster India's efforts to extend its military posture in the Indian Ocean. The U.S. can support India's development of high-value niche military capabilities. It can also enhance bilateral diplomatic coordination. This trio of investments, if it were to come to fruition, sound like pretty sound and sensible steps. Is Arzan pointing to something here that we can grasp onto to say, okay, you may not be getting everything you wish for, but actually there's a lot of room to maneuver here between these two countries?
And I do not disagree with Arzan at all on this. In fact, I would go further and say that the United States is already doing this. We are already supporting India in the Indian Ocean context. We actively collaborate with the Indian Navy on a variety of things in the Indian Ocean. We have already offered India advanced military capabilities, some of which can be described as niche capabilities, including in the context of protecting India's interests on the Sino-Indian border. And we are already engaged in diplomatic coordination, both through the Quad and through other mechanisms. So to my mind, these are not novel things that are out there waiting to be done. We are already doing them. To me, the bigger question is this: can these solutions in their totality serve to deter Chinese aggression, or can they help defeat that aggression if deterrence were to fail? And on that count, I'm not sure. These are important. but whether they can help us in what, to my mind, will be the most difficult challenge facing the United States. That's where the uncertainties lie. And I keep coming back to this ultimate contingency, not because I'm obsessed with it, though some might be.
You might be, yeah.
But because it is going to be the ultimate test of whether the United States will be able to preserve an Indo-Pacific political order that serves its own interests as well as the common good. And if we fail on that test, then everything that we are doing short of it will not matter as much. And that's why it's not surprising, to my mind, that, the Department of Defense constantly talks of China as the pacing threat, and our ability to protect our alliances, including the sort of tacit alliance we have with Taiwan, as being the critical yardsticks to measure America's military and political adequacy. So it's because those are the ultimate yardsticks which decide whether we will be able to preserve the world we want in the Indo-Pacific that I keep coming back to them. But let me say one other thing about Arzan's argument, which I think should not go unnoticed, right? Arzan is offering these suggestions precisely because he agrees with my core argument that there are limits to Indian support to the United States in any warfighting context. It's just that he believes that there are things we can do short of that, which I don't disagree with at all. But just helping people recognize that no matter how close we get and how deep the bilateral relationship develops, that there will still be a distinctiveness to this partnership. It will not become like an alliance-like relationship, is something that I think we need to, or at least I need to, reiterate over and over again, because our frame of thinking about our friendships inevitably refract through the model of alliances. And this is something that, we've had to struggle with for the last 20 years, because India in that sense is really unique. We have enemies. We know how to deal with those. We have allies. We have clear expectations of those. And then we have India in the middle. And so we are making this up as we go along. And so it becomes really important to remind people that no matter how good the going gets, India is still not going to play the role that other allies might play for us.
I mean, I think just as an editorial comment, right? This is my own view. Is this is where the headline that Foreign Affairs gave your piece is somewhat misleading, because your argument is that the bet still makes sense. It is still a good bet, but what you seem to be doing is really expectations management, saying that if you made this bet predicated on this particular outcome, then you're barking up the wrong tree, right? Because you made this bet for a variety of other reasons, the logic of which still holds. But we're almost kind of getting too far ahead of ourselves. At least that's my shorthand for the piece and the title. I don't know if you agree with that.
No, and I agree with that completely. Though I must confess a certain envy, to copy editors' ability to weave sexy headlines. It certainly pays off in ways sometimes that you don't expect.
Yeah, I mean, this is a piece in recording this, I think, almost a month or so after the pieces come out, and still on a daily basis, I'm having conversations about it, which in our think tank world of measuring impact, I would say is pretty good. Let me just segue a little bit to another issue, Ashley, because it's also kind of caught up in this question of expectations management, which is what people refer to as the quote-unquote next big thing in U.S.-India relations, which is ISET, or the Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies, right? Many people are on record as saying they believe this initiative can transform the relationship in the same manner or to the same degree as the civil nuclear deal did over a decade and a half ago. And ISET is still relatively new. We're still all figuring out what exactly it means, what it entails. I think the two governments are as well. But, sitting here observing these developments with the benefit of having lived this relationship in some sense, how do you evaluate the transformational potential of this ISET initiative?
Well, as you pointed out, Milan, it is still a work in progress. And it's not just simply a work in progress. We are at the earliest stages of what is a work in progress. I think it has transformational potential, but I'm cautious when people sort of describe it in dramatic terms as the next big thing. And the reason I'm cautious is not because I devalue the transformational potential. I just fear the fact that it has so many moving parts. Think about the civil nuclear deal that we signed in 2005. It was relatively simple in comparison. It involved commitments made between two governments, each to the other. And to the degree that there were outside players, there were just two outside players, the US Congress and the NSG. And the US government had enormous influence in both those bodies. And so in some ways, bringing the civil nuclear agreement to fruition was a relatively easy enterprise. When you look at the breadth of issue areas that ISET is dealing with, you're talking of multiple domains of activity. You're talking of multiple players. You're talking of multiple policy changes. You're talking of multiple investment decisions to be made by private actors in both countries. And multiple policy decisions that will be made not in the abstract. You can't get a portmanteau policy decision made that affects all the ISET areas. You'll have to make policy decisions in each one of these areas, right? This is going to be an enormously complicated enterprise. Do we want it to succeed? Absolutely. I think it will not just have an impact at the government to government level, but it will weave our two societies even more closely together if we can pull this off. But I think one should not underestimate the challenges that this will pose. And also the timelines. See, unlike the civil nuclear deal, we knew what the beginning was and we knew what the ending was. We don't know what the ending is with respect to ISET. We cannot define that. And so how do you measure success? I mean, that's going to be an interesting, discussion in its own right, because you'll have to measure success in times over, depending on the issue areas that you are focusing on. So I'm very hopeful about ISET. But given that I've lived through both the civil nuclear deal and, the DTTI effort that the Obama administration launched, I just want to be cautious with respect to the hype. Because again, as you point out, we might end up in the trap of creating these gigantic expectations that we cannot then fulfill.
Well, on the issue of expectations, let me just ask you, because in a couple of days, Prime Minister Modi is going to be in Washington. He will address a joint session of Congress, which I just want to flag for our listeners. This is from a WhatsApp forward, so I have not fact checked it, but the forward says there have been 4 world leaders who have ever addressed a joint meeting of Congress twice: Churchill, Mandela, Rabin, and Netanyahu, and Modi will be the 5th. Don't quote me on that, but it sounds right. He's going to receive a state dinner at the White House. Both sides are touting some significant milestones. Let's just start with the symbolism for a second. Again, having witnessed this relationship over time, what do you think this visit signifies at this particular juncture?
I think there are 2 explicit objectives that the administration is pursuing through the invitation to Prime Minister Modi for the state visit, and of course the coordinate activity of addressing Congress. I think the first is the administration wants to underscore India's importance to the United States, both in itself and for US interests. Um, this is something that has animated the administration ever since it came into office, which is why the metaphor of doubling down with respect to India is the correct one. And so this visit is really the vehicle to communicate clearly, underscore India's importance to the United States. The second aspect of it, I think, is this is an opportunity for President Biden to essentially strengthen what is an already good personal relationship with Prime Minister Modi. And I think you will see through various symbolic displays both these aspects, the governmental / strategic, as well as the personal, on display. The amount of time that President Biden will spend with the Prime Minister in different circumstances over the 3 days that he is in Washington, I think will communicate that very, very clearly. But I think there's also an implicit objective, which, I don't know whether will be advertised, but I think there is a desire to engage with Prime Minister Modi in an effort to encourage him to preserve what is best about India. And I think this administration has made a decision that the way in which you do that is to embrace the Prime Minister and to embrace India. And I must say, I think it is a strategically wise decision.
The administration certainly is not blind or ignorant about the churn in Indian domestic politics. There are many observers, including this one, who have written about concerns about democratic regression. And, at various points, U.S. officials have acknowledged these concerns, albeit in somewhat muted tones. So, going forward, is there a way in which U.S. officials can convey their concerns about India perhaps diverging or departing from its liberal commitments without jeopardizing the broader relationship? I mean, it seems to me from your previous answer that is what they're intending to do.
Well, let me say several things in response to the question you asked. First, the recognition about the churn in India, as you put it, is widespread throughout the U.S. government. The State Department's annual reports clearly testify to the fact that there is concern. Having said that, the U.S. government also faces a dilemma. And it's a dilemma that is not unique to India, but is one that is not going away either, which is how do you deal with problems involving your friends? Problems involving your adversaries are simple. You smack them around. But problems involving your friends are far more challenging to deal with. Now, what is unique about the Indian case is that we've never had to deal with India on this count before. We've had to deal with Pakistan. We've had to deal with a whole list of, countries who we would not treat in a way that we treat India. So dealing with India and the challenges of its democracy are entirely new for us. And I think we are simply feeling our way through. But this administration, because it has made so much about the struggle between democracy and autocracies and so on and so forth, I think is faced with a singular challenge of how to address this. This was not a problem for the Trump administration. Trump didn't care about the state of democracy in the world or even in our own country. But for the Biden administration, this is a serious issue. And I think what they will attempt to do is to speak to their Indian interlocutors quietly, respectfully, and I hope persistently. Because if we do not do these three things, then we run the risk that we will end up finally with a country that we're not entirely enthusiastic about. And that, to my mind, would be a real tragedy.
So we could go on for literally hours and hours and hours, but I will spare you that trial, Ashley, and just ask you one final question coming back to the substance of the visit here, and again this idea of breakthroughs and expectations. There is news coming out of both capitals that the administration is poised to sign off on a deal that would allow General Electric to produce jet engines that would power military aircraft, but that would also perhaps be used for export. This is being touted as a big step because Washington, as you said earlier, maintains pretty strict controls over what domestic military technology can be shared with other countries. If this deal were to come to pass, help us put it in the context of the U.S.-India defense partnership. How significant do you think it would be?
Well, I think it is very important because, as I often tell people, there are more countries that can build nuclear weapons that can build a jet engine. Building a jet engine is truly exotic technology, especially a jet engine that is meant to power combat aircraft. The fact that the administration is willing to permit GE to offer a significant transfer of technology at levels that the United States has not done in the past for any country that is not its ally is quite remarkable. Now, remember, India has been trying to build a jet engine now for about 40 years without great success. And so for the United States to finally help India cross that threshold has enormous significance. If the GE 404 engine is manufactured in India as we expect, if this deal goes through, it essentially means that a substantial portion of India's fighter force will have an American engine. It is very likely that the next generation Indian combat aircraft will also be equipped with an upgraded version of the same engine. It means that the United States will be in a pole position with respect to supporting the Indian Air Force for many, many decades to come. And that, I think, has very significant consequences.
My guest on the show this week is my colleague Ashley J. Tellis. He is the author of a recently published article in Foreign Affairs titled America's Bad Bet on India. Ashley, it's a testament to the argument and a testament to you and your scholarship that this has kept U.S.-India commentators busy over the past 4 weeks, discussing, debating, reading over and over, line by line, as well as their counterparts in government. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on once again.
It's a pleasure, Milan, always to join you on the podcast.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we reference on this week's episode, visit our website, granthamasha.com. Production assistance comes from Nithya Lab. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Isabel Villegas is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.